Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today let's talk about The Battle of Life by Charles Dickens. So if you don't know, I'm currently hosting a Christmas Dickens read-along where we're reading Charles Dickens's 5 Christmas novellas in publication order. The Battle of Life is number 4. This came about because I was hosting a much longer 2-year read-along called the Mega Dickens Read-along, where we were reading all of Dickens's full-length novels in chronological publication order. That read-along is now over, but I'll leave more information about all of this stuff down below, as well as a playlist of all of the videos I've done on Dickens's novels and novellas, etc. So anyway, today we're here to talk about The Battle of Life. The first part of this video will be spoiler free, and then I'll get into spoilers later on in the video. So before anything else, what is The Battle of Life about? It's a slightly different novella. It's set over 9 years, which is quite unusual for a novella, and we basically follow one family and the people around them at 3 sort of key stages of their lives, I suppose. So we start in the first section with Dr. Jedler, this man who believes that nothing in life is serious, that life is just a farce, you know, nothing is to be taken too seriously because the world is just ridiculous. And he lives with his 2 daughters, Grace and Marion. Marion is engaged to be married to Alfred, who has been a ward of the house for a while, but we can kind of tell from the first chapter that something isn't necessarily quite right between Marion and Alfred on Marion's side. Alfred goes away to study and we catch up with the family again 3 years later, and everything goes on from there. So in terms of my general thoughts, I really like The Battle of Life. This is, I think, my 4th read of The Battle of Life, probably, and I listened to the audiobook narrated by Jonathan Keeble, which I thought was really well done, actually. Very well performed. The narrator has a great voice. He also has an audiobook of The Haunted Man, which I'm listening to at the moment as well, and I definitely recommend it. I really like The Battle of Life, and I do think it's one that improves on a reread as well, because it's, like I said, it's quite an ambitious novella. We're fitting 9 years into sort of not that many pages, and because of that it's not necessarily immediately clear sort of where the story is going, but I do think it's quite effective, and I do think it's one where the more I reread it, the more I like it and find it interesting, and the more the characters grow on me, and especially the minor characters. Like, I would say that it's not the central characters that really win me to The Battle of Life. It's the minor characters, especially Clemency, Snitchy and Craggs, who I just adore so much. And I feel like sometimes in a short work, the side characters don't have as much time to be like developed, whereas in The Battle of Life, I feel like the side characters are wonderful. As I said, it is quite ambitious for a novella, which I think means it has a slightly unusual structure, and I definitely think there are some like less believable aspects of the plot, but overall I really enjoy it. I would say that probably, having not yet finished rereading The Haunted Man, my ranking of Dickens's Christmas novellas would be A Christmas Carol, The Haunted Man, The Battle of Life, The Chimes, then The Cricket on the Hearth, currently. But I will update you when I have finished rereading The Haunted Man. So thinking about The Battle of Life in terms of its chronology, it came out in December 1846, a year after The Cricket on the Hearth. So for the first 4 Christmas novellas, they came out 1 a year. So A Christmas Carol in 1843, The Chimes in 1844, The Cricket on the Hearth in 1845, and The Battle of Life in 1846. I think The Haunted Man was 2 years later in 1848. In many ways, I think it's going for a sort of similar vibe to The Cricket on the Hearth, this sort of heartwarming story, but I do think it has some sort of darker elements, especially because we kind of know that all this takes place on somewhere that used to be a battleground, which is quite unusual, but I quite like. It's definitely more ambitious than The Cricket on the Hearth, though. As I was saying when I made my video about The Cricket on the Hearth, that is a much simpler story, whereas I feel like in The Battle of Life, Charles Dickens is trying to do something more complicated. It's also the only one of Dickens's 5 Christmas novellas not to have a magical element, which I think is quite interesting, and it's also the only one that doesn't fit as neatly into my sort of like someone learning a lesson theory that I was talking about in terms of The Cricket on the Hearth. Like in the other 4 Christmas novellas, there is clearly a central protagonist who learns a lesson about something. And I think Dr. Jedler could kind of fit into that role within The Battle of Life. You know, we have this man who believes that nothing in life is ever serious. And, you know, there were suggestions from the beginning of the novella that maybe life is going to teach him to think more seriously about the world. But that's definitely not the focus of the story. And there are definitely other characters that learn lessons too. And it's definitely much more of an ensemble cast story than any of the other novellas. It feels like quite a bit of a departure for Charles Dickens' Christmas stories, and then it feels like he went back to some sort of more tried and tested ground with The Haunted Man, which is much more similar in a way to something like A Christmas Carol or The Chimes. Before I move away from chronology, one other thing I did want to say is that I like to imagine that Clemency in The Battle of Life is like a grown-up Tilly Slowboy from The Cricket on the Hearth. Like, I just feel like there's some similarities in their characters, but Clemency gets a lot more time in The Battle of Life than Tilly does in The Cricket on the Hearth, and Tilly's probably like my favourite character in The Cricket on the Hearth, even though she's not very important to the story. So I kind of like the idea that Tilly grows up to become Clemency, as it were. Let's talk a little bit about the premise and the plot of The Battle of Life. I think there's a lot of interesting elements to the premise. One is this idea that all of this is taking place on a bit of countryside that used to be a battleground many years ago. So there's sort of this history of violence hanging over this pleasant story, kind of suggesting that, you know, these everyday lives always have kind of the threat of violence or grief or sorrow kind of hanging over them, which I think is quite interesting. I also quite like the structure of The Battle of Life. As I said, it's set over 9 years, and we sort of pick up with the characters in 1 year, then we meet them again 3 years later, then 6 years after that. And I quite like that. Like, for me, it really works to get these sort of small glimpses of these different characters at different points in their lives, and seeing how people's like life positions change over time is really interesting. I suppose in a way, maybe that does make me think a bit of other Christmas Dickens stories, you know, like The Chimes and A Christmas Carol, where we see into the future, and we're seeing into the future like a possible future in a magical way in those stories, whereas here we actually get to follow the characters kind of through nearly a decade of their lives and see how their lives change, which I think is really nice. Beyond that, it's quite hard to talk about the plot of The Battle of Life without spoilers, because obviously it takes place over quite a long period of time, and circumstances change quite a lot between sections. Personally, I really like the structure of it. I really like the plot. I know that some elements of it push believability, and we've been chatting about this on the Discord server for the Christmas Dickens Readalong, but I'm just kind of happy to go with it when it comes to Dickens. And I'm kind of more happy to go with it here than I am in The Cricket on the Hearth. One thing I do find interesting is that it's not like the central plot and the central characters that I'm as invested in The Battle of Life. It's the minor characters and their plots, which I think is often how I feel in Dickens's full-length novels. Like, often my favourite characters are his eccentric side characters rather than his protagonists. But that's not usually how I feel in his novellas. I think because usually the minor characters get less time, but I just feel like there's a really strong supporting cast in The Battle of Life, which I really love. Let me talk a bit about the characters. There is, of course, Dr. Jedler, who believes that the world is just ridiculous. There's no point thinking about anything seriously in a farce such as this, as he often says. And I think he's quite interestingly drawn. We also have his 2 daughters, Marion and Grace, who are, in a way, the main characters. They're sort of the drivers of the plot, although I don't feel like either of them are hugely well developed, and nor is Alfred, who is Dr. Jedler's ward, who is Marion's suitor, fiance. I suppose they feel very like a lot of the protagonists in early Dickens novels, which is that they are nice, but they don't necessarily have as much substance or individuality to them as some of the more minor characters. However, when we come to the sort of secondary characters, though I feel like actually it's not necessarily that the secondary characters get less space in the novel, it's more that they're not like the drivers of the plot. But actually, as I said, it really is an ensemble cast novel. I feel like Michael Warden is a really interesting character. I like Britain a lot, and I love Clemency. Like, Clemency is the highlight of the novel for me. She is Dr. Jedler's servant, who is introduced as this sort of ridiculous, eccentric, preposterous person, and then you get to see that there's so much more to her, and I love that. And I also love Snitchy and Craggs, this pair of lawyers who are almost like each other's soulmates. They work so closely together and they're so devoted to each other, and I just love their characters so much, and I think they're wonderfully, wonderfully drawn and such a highlight of this novella. I don't think The Battle of Life would be my favourite of Dickens's Christmas novellas, but I feel like if I were to pick my favourite characters from any Dickens Christmas novella, it would probably be Clemency and Snitchy and Craggs. I want to talk a bit about the themes within The Battle of Life, because I do think there are lots of interesting themes. One thing that sort of sums up, in a way, the sort of theme and message of the novel is the messages on Clemency's thimble and nutmeg grater. That's only things that she says she has any time to read, because she's not very good at reading, so she'll only read her thimble and her nutmeg grater, one of which says on it, "Forget and forgive." The other one says, "Do as you would be done by." And these are the sayings that Clemency lives her life by, and that more people around Clemency could do with living their life by. And those 2 things are sort of part of the message of the battle of life, I would say. Another important theme is kind of like seriousness versus levity, and the contrast between them. So obviously you have Dr. Jedler, who believes the world is a farce, and we also have Mr. Craggs, who believes that the world is just too easy for everyone. Then we have various other characters who take the world more seriously, who perhaps have more emotional intelligence, and are able to tell that, you know, life sometimes is quite serious. And this sort of juxtaposition between seriousness and levity is set up right from the beginning. You know, the opening of the Battle of Life tells of this battlefield and these battles that took place here, and then goes on to show these two women sort of happily dancing. And that kind of contrast between happiness and unhappiness, seriousness and levity in life, I think is kind of an important theme within the Battle of Life. I have a few other themes I want to talk about, but I think I'm going to go into spoilers now. So if you haven't read The Battle of Life, do please head on away. If you have read The Battle of Life, please stick around. So I have a few other things I want to talk about in terms of that theme of sort of seriousness versus levity. As I said, I do think, like, if we think of The Battle of Life as being in keeping with Dickens's other Christmas novellas about someone who learns a lesson, then Dr. Jedler is kind of taught his lesson over the course of this book, that he should take the world more seriously. People's feelings matter more than he gives them credit for. When Marion runs away from home, Dr. Jedler realises that he hasn't been taking life seriously enough, and that actually there are some things that do really, really matter to him, such as his daughters. I don't necessarily think that is like the main point of the novel. Like, Dr. Jedler is going on his journey, but I feel like there's a lot of other things going on in the book. And then, as I said, Mr. Craggs spends the first two sections going around saying that life is too easy, and then dies before the third section, proving that life is not necessarily always that easy. And the other kind of events of the novel also prove that life isn't that easy. Life, as the title of the novella suggests, is sometimes a battle, but there are some very happy moments for all that. Another theme within the Battle of Life is the theme of grief. We have the grief of the family after Marion runs away. We have the grief of Grace and Clemency after they believe that Marion is dead. And we also have the grief that Mr. Snitchy feels for Mr. Craggs after Mr. Craggs dies. Let's take a moment here to bask in the glory that is Snitchy and Craggs. I just love them as characters so much, and I feel like they're such a highlight of this novella. Here we have this pair of lawyers who almost view themselves as one person, because they're part of the same legal partnership. They've worked together for a long time. Snitchy always answers for Self and Craggs. Even when his partner's dead, he says he's speaking for Self and Craggs deceased, as though he's still speaking for Mr. Craggs, even when Mr. Craggs is no longer with him to be spoken for. In my head, they are deeply in love, whether or not they know it, and their wives slightly suspect that, and that's why their wives detest their husband's business partner. But whatever the feeling is between them, they're obviously so close and so important to each other. And I just really enjoy them as characters. And I feel like how Mr. Snitchy has changed, and the way he talks about Craggs' death is so emotional. He makes this really wonderful speech talking about his partner's death. Mr. Craggs, sir, didn't find life, I regret to say, as easy to have and to hold as his theory made it out, or he would have been among us now. It's a great loss to me. He was my right arm, my right leg, my right ear, my right eye with Mr. Craggs. I am paralytic without him. His name remains in the firm to this hour. I try, in a childish sort of way, to make believe sometimes he's alive. You may observe that I speak for Self and Craggs. Deceased, sir, deceased. And later, when Clemency believes that Marion is dead, she says to Mr. Snitchy, "Tomorrow can't bring back the dead to life, mister." And he replies, "No, it can't do that, or it would bring back Mr. Craggs, deceased." And there's something about that line, the fact that he can't even like think about anyone's death or any grief without thinking of Mr. Craggs, which I just find really moving, and I just think it's done really, really well. Snitchy and Craggs, along with Clemency, are the highlights of the Battle of Life for me. Another important theme within the Battle of Life is that of sacrifice. So we later learn at the end of the novel that Grace sort of sacrificed herself for Marion. She was in love with Alfred, and she tried very hard to keep this back because she saw that Alfred was in love with Marion, and she let them get engaged without ever saying anything. But we then learn that Marion realised this and decided that actually she was going to make the sacrifice instead, and so she ran off and went and hid with her aunt in order to leave Alfred bereft of her to find his comfort in Grace, and to lead them to get married. Loving Alfred, but seeing that Alfred and Grace might be a better match pair than she and Alfred, Marion sacrifices her own love and happiness, and she also kind of sacrifices her reputation, which I think is quite interesting. So she doesn't just run away, she makes everyone think that she has run away with Michael Warden in order for her family and Alfred to feel that she is definitely lost to them forever. And this idea of sort of putting the happiness of others before the happiness of yourself is very, very important to the Battle of Life and to the message of the Battle of Life, I would say. That kind of ties in with Dr. Jedler's feeling that nothing is serious, but this is obviously a very serious thing. Marion takes this sacrifice very, very seriously. She's separated from her family for a long time before she returns home at the end. I think another theme in the Battle of Life is kind of like what is valuable in life, or like what is precious and serious in life. So I feel like domestic and family life are kind of held up within the Battle of Life, especially in the last section, symbolised both kind of in Clemency and Britton's marriage, and also in Grace and Alfred's. I think sort of personal connection and valuing the people around you is also shown to be serious and important. And I think also sort of everything that Clemency stands for is shown to be very important. I think Clemency is such a great character, and I love the way Dickens shows you more about her over the course of the story. It's not exactly character development because Clemency doesn't change, but Clemency slowly changes people around her. She softens Britton into a slightly different person, and she has a very positive impact on those around her. Dickens does this clever thing with Clemency where he introduces her as one of his sort of eccentric characters that we're meant to sort of find comic more than anything else. She was about 30 years old and had a sufficiently plump and cheerful face that it was twisted up into an odd expression of tightness that made it comical. But the extraordinary homeliness of her gait and manner would have superseded any face in the world. To say that she had 2 left legs and somebody else's arms, and that all 4 limbs seemed to be out of joint and to start from perfectly wrong places when they were set in motion, is to offer the mildest outline of reality. To say that she was perfectly content and satisfied with these arrangements and regarded them as being no business of hers, and that she took her arms and legs as they came and allowed them to dispose of themselves just as it so happened, is to render faint justice to her equanimity. Her dress was a prodigious pair of self-willed shoes that never wanted to go where her feet went, blue stockings, a printed gown of many colours, and the most hideous pattern procurable for money, and a white apron. She always wore short sleeves and always had, by some accident, grazed elbows, in which she took so lively an interest that she was continually trying to turn them round and get impossible views of them. We're introduced to Clemency as this utterly ridiculous person, and then over the course of the novel, Dickens slowly unpacks Clemency as a character to show us that she is far more emotionally intelligent, far more moral, good, and kind than most other people in the story. Like, obviously, Marion's, like, great sacrifice is meant to be important, but for me, the moral heart of the Battle of Life is Clemency, and she's a really wonderful way of sort of Dickens contradicting Dr. Jedler's idea that life is a farce, because we're introduced to Clemency and we're like, yeah, she's ridiculous, life is a farce, but then we learn that actually beneath that silly exterior, she is so kind and organised and valuable. Britton ultimately recognises at least some of the value in her. They get married and they open an inn called the Nutmeg Grater, which I love. And then Clemency, like, organises everything in the inn. Britton thinks that he's organised everything, but actually Clemency is in charge. She knows what she's doing. She may occasionally look a little bit silly, but actually she's very capable and very competent, and she runs the business and does it really well. And I think it's also interesting that Dickens kind of puts the reader in the same position as Clemency in terms of what Clemency knows and how Clemency is reacting to things. So when Marion meets Michael Warden to persuade him to agree to sort of partake of the deception when she is running away but not with him, then Clemency sees them meet, thinks that they are going to elope together, so does the reader. And then later, when Clemency thinks that the Marion is dead, so does the reader. We're sort of following her emotional arcs, which I think is really interesting. And in general, I just love Clemency, and I feel like Dickens draws her really, really well. And I feel like Clemency, in a way, kind of represents a lot of the themes of the novel about sort of what you ought to value in life and how sometimes there is a lot of serious significance behind something that looks silly. I want to talk a little bit about the ending and sort of the plot in spoilery terms, because obviously it is a little bit silly that Marion has been like hiding herself at Aunt Martha's house for 6 years and Grace and Alfred didn't know and Dr. Jedler didn't know for the first while. Is that stretching believability a little bit? Yes. And I also feel like it feels very mean that Dr. Jedler knew for a long time and didn't tell Grace and Alfred. And it also feels a bit unfair of Marion that although she was in love with Alfred and he was in love with her, she decided that actually she knew best who would suit him best, and therefore she would leave him in order to ensure he one day fell in love with Grace. And obviously he then does fall in love with Grace and marries Grace, and they seem very happy, but it does feel like Marion made his choice for him, which bothers me on the one hand, but on the other hand, I feel like there's so many incidences in Victorian novels where men make big decisions like that for women, that it's kind of balancing to have a woman make that decision for a man. I also find it weird that Alfred knows before Grace, and I feel like Alfred would surely feel quite complicatedly about all this, but, you know, he doesn't seem to. It's fine. It's a Christmas novella. And I do like this suggestion that Michael Warden and Marion will probably get married one day in the future, because I do like Michael Warden as a character, and I feel like his development and journey is quite interesting. And in fact, I suppose he, like Dr. Jedler, has learned his lesson over the course of the novel. He too didn't take life seriously, you know, in quite a different way to Dr. Jedler, in a more spendthrift, rakish way, but he has also learned to take life more seriously and now might be a good partner for Marion in life. I think that's all I wanted to say. In general, I really like The Battle of Life, and I feel quite fond of it, having read it a few times now, in a way that I don't feel like I've got fonder of The Cricket on the Hearth. And there's something about The Battle of Life and kind of meeting these characters at different points in time, and especially the sort of minor characters, that I just absolutely love. I feel like Clemency is so wonderful, and Snitchy and Craggs I just love. So that is all for now. Do let me know down in the comments, what did you think of The Battle of Life? How are you getting on with the Christmas Dickens read-along so far? I'm looking forward to reading and reviewing The Haunted Man very soon, hopefully before Christmas, maybe just after Christmas, depending on how this goes. We will see. That's all for now. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.